This morning we talked about, as I said, it's the bad news that's necessary for us to absorb, because if I don't go there and don't know the power of this thing that is causing us to destroy our lives, we're sabotaging our lives, and we seem to be not able to stop doing it. And the biggest fallacy that I've seen over 30 years is people attempting to treat it and to remedy it at a very superficial level. And believe me, this is not superficial. This is a very deep-seated, embedded program, if you like, that is working against our best interests. And so in his latter days as a psychoanalyst, Sigmund Freud came to believe that some people have in them what he called a death instinct. You know, there was the libido, which is the life instinct, and he believed that he saw evidence of a mortido, a death instinct. And in some ways, you know, it wouldn't be hard to come to believe something like that when you watch people who are otherwise intelligent doing something that is so sabotaging everything they want to accomplish in their lives. And often very talented people, very bright people, and you know, it's a kind of a puzzle. Carl Menninger, the famous clinician, wrote a book called Man Against Himself, the phenomenon of self-defeat. And it has puzzled people for thousands of years why an organism like us would systematically start to sabotage their life. It's an anomaly. And we seem not yet to have any really good answers as to why. So a lack of power, that is our dilemma. And yes, Laura?
And as far as we know, it's restricted to the human genus?
We don't know. I haven't read anywhere that there is another species that so systematically sabotages everything that they do. And, you know, it's possible they have maybe come up with some of our close relatives who do that too, but I'm not sure. We seem to have no mental defense, sober, against doing this. Something runs around our mental defense and doesn't seem to be stopped by it. Do any of you know who Craig Ferguson is? He's a guy with a nighttime talk show on, what channel is it? It's after one of the channels anyhow. He's kind of like on opposite Letterman and Jay Leno. And Craig Ferguson, he's a guy with a Scottish accent. And and he's very funny, but he also happens to have our problem. And he says, for years, he said he couldn't successfully handle it until he finally got it. He said, I came to realize that we're mentally ill. And he says, alcoholics are mentally ill. And he said, we may be the aristocracy of the mentally ill, but we are mentally ill. And he said, it's very hard for us who function otherwise quite well, quite bright, quite intelligent, quite competent. It's hard for us to imagine that clean and sober, we have a mental illness. And that is, I think, the great stumbling block. We would like to think it's a bad habit. We'd like to think it would respond to these, you know, firm purpose of changing my life and sincerity. and determination and perseverance doesn't yield to these kind of virtuous attacks. So that gets us then, after powerlessness, we come to step 2. And step 2 in AA reads, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And this is the step where people's brains fall out. People get really stupid when they get to step 2. Because the next thing you hear them talking about is that they believe in God. They've always believed in God. And as though that's what the step is about. And first of all, it doesn't talk about faith at all. In fact, one of the things in studying theology, one of the things we used to say was, belief is a bounce, faith is a leap. You know, belief, I believe in Crest toothpaste. Does that mean I fall down and worship a tube of Crest? I mean, I believe does not mean, and also, if you just notice the wording of it, it says, came to believe. There's like half of the people in almost every group will tell you, oh, I believe in God. I've always believed in God. Well, God is in for a shock. Because if God, whatever or whoever that is watching, they see you believing in drugs and alcohol. And repeatedly returning to drugs and alcohol to cope with your life. But I believe in God. I've always believed. Our behavior shouts lots louder than our words. And mental illness, if you want to talk about mental illness, often is measured by how distant my mind, what it knows, is from reality. If this is reality and this is my mind, this would be health. If I think I am believing in God while using drugs and alcohol to cope with my life, I'm not near well, right? So they even describe the differences, like neurotic is somebody who is off this way. A psychotic has a completely different reality. They'll say neurotics build castles in the air and psychotics move into them. That's kind of one of the things they tell you, like as a way of remembering these things. So most of us are just neurotic. We believe stuff that isn't quite in touch with reality. And so when we come to this came to believe, we have to realize that people have, because what often happens is, if you've had some religious background, what people tend to do at that point is they start praying. Like prayer. And the problem with this is that we have a misunderstanding, I think, of what's going on. The people have prayed their ass off for thousands of years to no avail in alcoholism. Some of the people have prayed the most, drank the most. I come from Ireland. We have a lot of very pious drunks in Ireland. They wouldn't miss a day saying the rosary. That many of them go to Mass every morning and are drunk on their ass by noon. You know, I mean, praying. People have tried this for thousands of years, and to somehow imagine that praying was discovered in 1935. It suddenly dawned on an alcoholic in 1935, maybe I should pray. Like, I mean, to imagine that that was the first time that ever happened is really crazy. It's like the other thing I talked about. Aristotle's grandmother probably prayed. So when we talk about what this program of recovery is about, it's not about praying. It's not about asking God to help me not to drink. Believe me, people have tried that and tried it with greater sincerity and greater fervor and with greater consistency than any of us. And it didn't work. When I was growing up in Ireland, I was in a kind of a country parish. There was always the town parish and the country parish, you know, around any town. And the parish I was in was country, which usually meant that you had a pastor, the head priest in the place, and then you usually had an assistant pastor. And generally, assistant pastors are young guys in their 20s. Except that in our parish, assistant pastors were usually in their 50s. And why they were assistant pastors in their 50s was because they were alcoholics. And and some of them were just so holy. I mean, the Irish are crazy anyway, but the Irish have a kind of almost a cult of the drunk holy priest. And so when you have the one particular that I keep thinking of, because I was an altar boy, and I would go over like for the 6:30 a.m. Mass on a weekday, and the church would be cold and closed and all of this, and you would open it, and Father Frank Doherty was kneeling in the dark. He'd been there for hours. And when you left to go to school about 8:30 or so, Father Frank would be down in the church still praying. And then about every maybe 3 or 4 months, maybe 6 months, you would go over and there would be no priest show up for Mass. And you would go down to the parochial house and ring the bell, and the housekeeper would go, "Oh, go up and tell them there'll be a priest up in a minute." And the pastor would come up, you know, all just right out of bed, you know. And I would go home and I'd tell my parents, I'd say, "Father Doherty wasn't there this morning." And they'd look at each other knowingly and go, "Oh, Frank's off again." And so it meant Frank was off on a tear, and he had to be detoxed again, and he'd show up kind of shamefacedly about 6 weeks later. He had gone through a spin dry of some sort. And but, you know, I mean, so praying as the answer to alcoholism just has not worked. And so that is... You want to be careful you're not going out of here after 28 days, 3 months, whatever the heck length of time you're here, and going out and counting on doing something that wasn't working already in 1935. Right? Does that make any sense? You know, I mean, to go out there and think that, oh, I'm going to do some psychotherapy. Well, Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud did better psychotherapy, believe me, than your therapist. And they did it a lot more intensely. And they had zero success with alcoholics. So if you're planning on any of these things that you're going to do after you leave treatment, please don't do something that was already not working and had not been working for hundreds, maybe thousands of years before 1935. It's just, I think it just makes common sense. When we come to look at step 2, I used to teach English. So words are important. And that's one of the things I learned about English was words are important. And sometimes we read what is not there. And so the way a lot of people read step 2 is came to believe that a power, meaning what they're really saying is, came to believe that God would cure my alcoholism. Which would be great if you believed in God. But then we go back to my first thing, which is you believe in alcohol. So all of a sudden you're going to get the fire truck. You know, I mean, it's not. We're not talking then, if, you know, one of the things that sometimes happens in treatment centers, you'll have somebody, maybe a new counselor or something, give them the impression like in the second or third week, well, by now, you must have found a higher power. And of course, you know, to me, that's just like really horrible. I mean, I have some degrees in theology and stuff because being a priest, you had to do degrees in theology, and then I went on and did a doctorate and all of this kind of stuff. So for anybody who knows anything about theology, the idea that in your third week of treatment, you're going to get faith. I mean, it's just nearly asinine. Maybe totally asinine, you know. So, you know, faith is a gift from God. I mean, everybody sort of agrees on this. So, you know, and what are my chances of getting a gift from God if I already am maintaining that I have it, right? So the first thing you need to do to even be a candidate for grace, for the gift of faith would be?
Stop believing God.
Huh?
To believe in God.
Well, that's what faith is.
Yeah, well, that's...
Huh? The first thing you would have to say is, my behavior is telling me that I don't have faith. I may believe there is a God, which is not the same thing at all. But believing in God, which is what faith is so if my behavior is showing what I believe in, I had this pointed out to me by an agnostic when I was about, you know, the third year in failing in AA. The guy said to me, well, are you going to take the second step? And I said, well, I've always believed in God. And he said, what has that got to do with it? He said, first of all, I would challenge that you believe in God. And I said, kind of, how dare you, you know? And this is a guy who had like 15 years sobriety and was an agnostic. And I'm a priest and I'm drunk on my ass still. And so, and yet I'm indignant that he might suggest that I was lying to myself. And he said, let me ask you this question then. If you were selling Tylenol, and you believed in Tylenol because it doesn't cause your stomach to bleed and stuff, and you believed in it as a painkiller, but when you got a headache, you went and bought Bayer aspirin. What do you believe in? Why? That's what you bought for your own headache, right? So even though you thought that Tylenol is a good product, you used aspirin for your headache. So he said, you go over to your church. And he said, you pray in your church, God, you are my refuge and my strength. You are my hope, my consolation, my rock and my fortress. When I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. And he said, and then you go back to your room and you pour this much whiskey. And that is your refuge, your strength, your hope, your consolation, your rock, your fortress. And when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you fear no evil, for Jack Daniels is with you. And he said, the